My name is Vonda, and I'm 33 years old. I still remember the exact moment I realized my mother-in-law had stopped seeing me as a person. It wasn't during one of her usual cold remarks at dinner, or when she'd correct the way I set the table in my own home. It was a Tuesday evening in November, when she gathered every single member of her family in her living room, her 3 daughters, their husbands, my brother-in-law Greg, his wife, 2 aunts, and my husband, Trevor, and announced that she wanted to hold a vote. A family vote. About me. I was standing just outside the doorway to the kitchen, holding a tray of teacups I'd been asked to bring out, when I heard her say it. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, like she'd been planning this moment for weeks. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly because these words are burned into my memory, "Should Vonda be banned from family events?" She didn't lower her voice. She didn't look toward the hallway. She just said it out loud, like I was a policy being put to a vote and not a woman who had spent 9 years loving her son, raising his child, and building a life with this family. I stood there, frozen, the tray shaking slightly in my hands. And then they all raised their hands. Every single one of them. I didn't drop the tray. I don't know how, but I didn't. I set it down quietly on the side table in the hallway, walked back to the kitchen, and stood at the sink with the water running so no one could hear me breathing. My chest felt like it had caved in. 9 years. 9 years of holiday dinners, birthday parties, hospital visits, baby showers, and school recitals, and every hand in that room went up without a second's hesitation. What broke me wasn't even the vote itself. It was what happened about 20 minutes later, when my son Caleb came and found me in the kitchen. He's 8 years old, and he has his father's eyes and my stubbornness, and when he walked in and looked at my face, he already knew something was wrong. He tugged my sleeve the way he always does when he needs my full attention, and he said, "Mom, why are they doing this?" His voice cracked on the last word. He'd been sitting in the hallway. He'd heard everything. I knelt down right there on the kitchen tile and I held him. I didn't cry in front of him. I saved that for later, much later, when he was asleep. But in that moment, hugging my son while the sound of Trevor's family laughing drifted in from the living room, something shifted inside me. It went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that means you've given up. The kind that means you've made a decision. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I wasn't a difficult daughter-in-law. I'm not saying that to make myself look good. I'm saying it because it matters for what comes next. I cooked for that woman when she had her knee surgery. I drove her to her follow-up appointments because Trevor was working and none of her daughters volunteered. I planned her 60th birthday party, booked the venue, made the seating arrangement, ordered the cake she specifically wanted from a bakery 40 minutes away. I did all of that while working full-time as a medical billing coordinator and raising Caleb almost entirely on my own because Trevor travels for work 3 weeks out of every month. The tension between us had been building for years, but it had never been about anything real. It was always small things. She didn't like how I dressed Caleb for church. She thought I was too direct when I spoke. She once told Trevor in front of me that I had no softness. What she meant was that I didn't shrink when she wanted me to. I didn't reshape myself to fit whatever version of a daughter-in-law she had in her head, and she never forgave me for that. The vote was her way of making it official. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 weeks before that evening, I had gone to see a family attorney. Not because I was planning anything dramatic. I'd gone because Trevor and I had been quietly discussing separation for months, and I wanted to understand my rights. I wanted to know where I stood before things got complicated. My attorney, a sharp woman named Ms. Caldwell, had started pulling together documentation. Financial records. Property assessments. A record of the informal loan Trevor's mother had given us years ago, the one she'd always dangled over my head but never put in writing. That Tuesday evening, sitting on the kitchen floor with Caleb in my arms, I texted Ms. Caldwell one sentence. Move forward. I didn't fight back that night. I didn't walk into that living room and say a single word to any of them. I bathed my son, read him his story, turned off his light, and went to bed. I let them have their vote. I let them believe they had one. But the next week, they received a letter from a law firm. And inside was something that shut them up immediately. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. I know this because Trevor called me at 9:47 a.m., and his voice was different from any tone I had ever heard from him in 9 years of marriage. Not angry. Not defensive. Something closer to rattled. The voice of a man who had just realized that the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. He said, "Vonda, my mother got something in the mail." I told him I knew. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Trevor, your entire family raised their hands to ban me from family events while our son sat in the hallway and listened. I don't owe anyone a warning." He didn't have an answer for that. Miss Caldwell had sent a formal legal notice outlining several things simultaneously. First, it addressed the informal loan his mother had given us 4 years ago, $32,000 that had never been documented, never assigned an interest rate, and had been used repeatedly as emotional leverage whenever his mother wanted to remind me of my place. Miss Caldwell had drafted a repayment structure and proposed a clear, legally binding agreement that would convert that vague gift into a formal loan with terms. No more gray area. No more power in that money. Second, the letter outlined the division of marital assets in the event of a separation, including the equity we had built in our home, Trevor's retirement accounts, and the business profit-sharing arrangement he'd entered 2 years prior, none of which his family seemed to have realized I had full legal awareness of. Third, and this was the part that apparently made his sister actually put the letter down and leave the room, Ms. Caldwell had included a formal notice regarding defamation. A family meeting, held with multiple adult witnesses, at which I was declared unwelcome and voted out of my own family circle, could be argued as coordinated reputational harm. We weren't filing anything yet. But we were documenting everything, and they needed to know that. His mother called me that same afternoon. First time she had dialed my number directly in over 2 years. Her voice was careful in a way it had never been with me before. She said she hoped there had been some misunderstanding. I let her finish. Then I told her, calmly and without any satisfaction in my voice, that there had been no misunderstanding at all. I had been standing in her hallway. I had heard her ask the room whether I should be banned. I had watched every hand go up. My son had heard it too, and he had cried, and that was the part one would never forget. She started to say something about how the evening had gotten emotional and things were taken out of context. I told her that a vote was not a context issue. A vote was a decision. And I had simply made one of my own. What followed over the next several weeks was not a dramatic courtroom battle or a screaming match at a family dinner. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder. Trevor and I sat down together, without his family present, and had the most honest conversation we'd had in years. He was not a villain in this story. I want to be clear about that. He was a man who had spent his entire life managing his mother's emotions and had never fully understood the cost of that habit until he saw it itemized in a legal document. He cried during that conversation. I did too. We talked about Caleb. We talked about what we actually wanted versus what we had each been silently enduring. It wasn't a reconciliation, not fully, not right away. But it was real in a way that nothing between us had been in a long time. His family's behavior changed almost immediately after the letter. The aunt who had raised her hand fastest, a woman named Rosette who had always spoken to me like I was hired help, sent me a text saying she hoped we could move past things. His sister, who had organized the seating at that meeting like it was a formal proceeding, suddenly became very interested in Caleb's school schedule and started sending him cards in the mail. I didn't respond to any of it with anger. I didn't need to. I had already stopped needing their approval, and that shift, that specific internal shift, was the most powerful thing that happened through all of this. Not the letter. Not the legal notice. The moment I stopped caring whether they accepted me. Caleb asked me one evening, about a month after everything, whether we were still going to Grandma's house for Christmas. I told him the truth in the gentlest way I could, that things were changing, and that wherever we spent the holidays, I would make sure he felt loved and safe. He thought about that for a second, the way he does when he's processing something, and then he said, "Good? Because I didn't like how they made you feel, Mom." 8 years old. He saw everything. I'm not going to tell you my life became simple after that Thursday letter arrived. It didn't. There were hard months, difficult legal conversations, long nights where I questioned every decision. But I never once regretted sending that text to Ms. Caldwell. Not for a single moment. Because what I learned through all of this is something I want every woman watching this to hear clearly. Silence is not the same as weakness, and patience is not the same as surrender. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop explaining yourself to people who are never willing to understand you and let your next move do the talking instead. They held a vote to remove me from the family. What they didn't realize was that I had already decided to outgrow them entirely. And that decision, quiet, deliberate, and completely mine, shut them up in a way no argument ever could have.